All right, I think it's time to get started. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the Alexandria Historical Society's first History Behind the Scenes event of 2025. My name is Scott Vierick, and I have the privilege of serving on the board of this organization, and I'm very excited about tonight's program because I used to work for a historical consulting company where I served as the senior oral historian for a number of years. So not only am I very grateful that Alexandria has such a robust oral history program, but I'm also very excited that the oral historian leading that program is here with us tonight to discuss the program and provide some insights and ideas about how you can conduct oral histories or how you can get involved with the city's program. So for those of you who are joining us tonight for the first time, the Alexandria Historical Society is a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to the research and study of Alexandria and Northern Virginia history. We host lectures and special events throughout the year, and we also publish a journal called the Alexandria Chronicle. We are also in the process of soliciting nominations for our annual History Awards, which recognize the best of public history in the Port City. So if you know of an individual or organization who has gone above and beyond in the research, interpretation, preservation, anything related to history in Alexandria, we do encourage you to nominate them, and you can do so by emailing AlexandriaHistoricalSociety@gmail.com. So the same email address you used to register for the event tonight. Before we dive into the talk, a couple of quick notes about how this is all going to work. So Peggy Harlow, my talented fellow board member, she's going to be handling the tech aspects of the program tonight. We know that many of you have questions about oral histories, about the city's oral history program. So if you have a question, when we get to the Q&A at the end of the presentation tonight, put that question in the chat. Peggy will send it to me, and I'll ask it to Francesco. So pretty straightforward. So without further ado, now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I'd like to introduce our very special guest. So Francesco di Salvatore has been conducting oral histories for over 10 years. They started with StoryCorps in Chicago, where they helped build a large oral history collection about Chicago and the greater Illinois region, including a major collection about the history of mass incarceration in the region. They then worked with the National Public Housing Museum, where they also built a large oral history collection, before moving on to be a senior library specialist at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Later, they worked as a graduate teaching assistant at George Washington University, and in 2022, they came here to Alexandria to become the manager and curator of the Alexandria Oral History Center. Francesco holds a BFA from DePaul University, an MA in history from the University of Illinois Chicago, another MA in American Studies from George Washington University, and a PhD in American Studies from George Washington University, which they just recently completed in 2024. So Francesco, thank you so much for being here tonight. Very excited to talk to you about your experiences and insights about oral history. But to start off, I'd like to ask you just a little bit about how you first became interested in oral histories. How did you decide to make that your career?
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And yeah, thanks for having me tonight. I'm excited to talk about oral history and the Oral History Center. So in terms of how I became an oral historian, my background in oral history doesn't really start in history. It really comes from other disciplines, and I found a way to meld them. And so, really, I think my interest really started when I was studying theater in undergrad, and I became really interested in documentary theater and community devised theater. And so, for those who aren't familiar with that form of theater, it was a kind of theater that really started in the 60s. It was a way to tell people's stories to the public, and instead of relying on playwrights and plays that have been done over and over again. There was companies springing up in the '60s that really interested in bringing communities together to tell their stories on their terms. And so fast forward, many decades later, and I'm studying these forms of theater, and I'm working in Chicago for a theater company that does that kind of work. And it really quickly became clear to me that again, having people tell their stories on their own terms was so imperative, and so needed, that I started to dabble with oral history, and as Scott said, I ended up starting working for StoryCorps in Chicago, and building an oral history collection there. But even before then, I also was interested in art therapy and healing work. Right? How can storytelling be a way for us to repair past harms? Right? How can us witnessing people telling their truths be a way for us to heal from the past? And I was also just really interested in just documentaries and podcasts and finding creative ways to activate stories. And so I've always been interested in, not just how do we build a collection, but what do we do with the collection, which is, I think, in oral history, but in general with most collections, is the big question. There's so many different archives that people just don't know about. Stories, materials that just people haven't accessed. And so I'm always trying to think of creative ways to activate those materials. So yeah, that's kind of a quick synopsis, and Scott kind of gave my overview of all my other projects.
Absolutely,
So.
absolutely, and I think that's your point about capturing people's stories and allowing them to tell their story is such a huge part of what oral history is about. And we'll talk a little bit about the challenge and the opportunity of archives and connecting people to archives in a little bit. But I want to take a step back, and for anybody who's still a little uncertain about what we're talking about when we say oral history, can you give a definition of it as you understand it and share that with the rest of the group?
Sure. So I mean, I'll give the 101 response, and then I'll give the more philosophical response. But just the basics of oral history, right? When we talk about oral history, what we're talking about really is a conversation or an interview that's recorded, right? So it's not just a conversation at the street corner or by the water cooler, but it's a very intentional, well thought out conversation that has had a lot of prep work before the microphones are turned on or the video cameras start rolling. It always includes, right, an interviewer and a narrator. There can sometimes be a reversal or a blending. Sometimes the interviewer becomes a narrator. Sometimes the narrator becomes an interviewer. People are talking to each other, asking each other questions. That commonly happens with StoryCorps. If you listen to StoryCorps and NPR, right, those are usually conversations between people. Those aren't traditional kind of format of an interview just asking questions. They usually are about past memories, right? They're usually about people's recollections of their childhoods, of their early adulthoods, but they also, and there's nothing wrong with this, they can be about the present or the near past, right? And so, for example, what we do, we sometimes do oral histories about the COVID pandemic, right? And that's very much in the in the near past. Or we talk about present moments, right? We've done recordings about ACRP, if you're familiar with the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, people's experience, going to Alabama and being a part of that. It also can be about the future, right? The beauty of oral history is that it's very reflective, and people can reflect on what they want to see in the future, what they want to see from the city of Alexandria, for example, what changes they want to see, what changes they want to see within themselves, right? So we're kind of covering all these different timelines when we talk about oral history. And then, there's always some form of preservation, right? We always want to preserve what we recorded, right? Now, I'll get into this maybe a little later, but we also need people's consent to do that, right? And that's very important for oral history. But there's some form of preservation, right? With the idea that future generations can listen to these, um, exhibits can be made with these, books can be written with these, etc. And basically, I would think of oral history as three sort of steps, right? We have the pre-interview, um, which I can get into now, but the pre-interview is really a time for the interviewer, the oral historian, to really just sit down with the narrator and just have a conversation about what they want to talk about. Um, and so this can look like a 30-minute conversation. This can look like a 3-hour conversation. This could look like multiple meetings. It really depends upon, who you're working with. But this is real. This is a really important time. If there hasn't been an existing relationship, this is the time to create that relationship. And I'll get more into that, sort of the importance of relationships in oral history, but just to kind of go through the steps here. But so once you complete that phase, usually that phase includes creating a list of a list of questions that are going to be asked. It usually includes copious notes about you as the oral historian knowing sort of kind of major life moments that they plan to cover. So that, you don't really want to be surprised in an interview. It's okay if it happens, but as an interviewer, you do want to have a sense of who you're interviewing, so that you can best help them tell their story versus kind of be surprised by, oh, that they mentioned this massive moment in their life and you're taken aback by it. But you do want to be kind of, yeah, you'll be able to kind of be able to walk through with them versus kind of deal with your own feelings in the moment, per se. So once you finish that pre-interview phase, you move on to the interview, which is what we know about oral history, right? The interview. So that can typically be a 40-minute conversation. It could be a 3-hour conversation or interview. Again, it really depends upon the interview. And this is either audio recorded or video recorded. And then, once you finish that, you obviously get into what we call the post-interview phase. And this is where narrators sign a release form, telling you how they want their story to be used, and I'll talk more about that. But this is an important phase of them kind of deciding how they put their story out in the world. This is also where we archive it or preserve the oral history, right? So that includes generating what we call metadata. In other words, that's a way of saying creating ways, keywords for people to be able to search for these oral histories in the archive, so they're easily accessible. So if someone's doing researching African American history, they can just type in a search bar African American history and find every single oral history related to that, for example. This is where narrators also review their transcript, right? So you always create a transcript of an oral history, or you should, just to have another format of it. And this is where they review it, let you know if they're comfortable with it, if they want to change things. And then, finally, once everything sort of settled and the narrator officially confirms they're okay with it, that's when we go into actually archiving it and presenting it to the public. So yeah, those are kind of the three stages. Those are kind of the basics of oral history, right? But I would say those are some hard rules, but you can really play with it a lot, right? You can do interviews while you're walking around the neighborhood, for example, right? Versus sitting at a table. Sometimes walking around someone's old neighborhood, and just naturally invokes all kinds of memories for people. You can do group discussions versus one-on-one, right? So we call those story circles, which I could talk about later too, but those tend to be like, sometimes 5 to 6 people in a circle with me, and we're kind of going around, talking about a certain topic that, that relates to each of them. So there's ways you can play with it. And so I think some of the deeper things to think about when we talk about oral history, and I think what makes it such a powerful, not just tool, but it's a powerful way of doing history, that um, I'm really passionate about. I really believe in, and so you know, and so what do I mean by the process? So it's not simply just an interview, right? It's not simply just me interviewing someone, but what when you embark on oral history, what you're really doing is you're saying that we're going to center the narrator's experience in this, right? We're not going to center necessarily my research needs, my interests, my biases. These obviously will always play a factor. It's impossible to be completely objective. It's impossible. But you're trying your best to minimize those as you center someone's experience, someone's memories. Um, and so, what does it mean to center someone in the making of history? So I'll get kind of into that. So what I mean by that is one characteristic of it is that there should be rolling consent throughout the entire oral history process. Um, Happy New Year. Someone wrote that in the chat. So what do I mean by that? You know, I mentioned those those kind of three steps: pre-interview, interview, post-interview. Throughout all of that, as an oral historian, you really need to be checking in with the narrator, at each step. It could be as simple as, are you comfortable with what's happened so far, right? Are you comfortable with these list of questions we developed? Even during the interview, are you comfortable in this moment with what you've just shared? Do you want us to stop? In the post-interview process, when we get to the release form, are you comfortable with us archiving this and it being public, right? For me, and I think in general, when it comes to oral history, it's a success for someone to decide how they want their story used. So if they decide it's not archived, awesome. Like that's a success. If someone wants it archived and preserved, that's also a success. But again, it's about receiving the consent from the person. Um, it also means, when we say center a narrator, we also mean following the time. I like to call this, kind of following the time of trust and care, right? Trust and care is one of the most important things for oral history. If we don't have those, no one's really going to want to talk to you, right? No one's going to want to share, some of their most traumatic moments in their lives, for example, or some of their happiest memories, right? There really has to be a relationship, some form of trust and relationship that exists, right? And that's why that pre-interview phase is really important. Um, and I mentioned, I think I said, like, it could be 30 minutes, it could be 3 hours, but I've sometimes known someone for over a year or two before we've ever sat down to do a recording, right? I mean, I'm not saying that we're talking weekly and but there's it sometimes took that long for me to then move on to doing an interview with them, right? And that's okay, right? I mean, unfortunately, I think this kind of goes against sort of this imperative sometimes we have in our culture of getting things done and having deadlines, but it doesn't really jibe well with oral history because again, if you don't have that trust and care, it's just not going to be a success. Um, we also talk a lot about in the field, trauma informed approaches to oral history, right? So not all oral histories are going to be about people's trauma or about hard moments, but sometimes they are. Um, Especially because oral history as a discipline, it really sprang up from from the bottom up, right? Oral history as discipline it came about because scholars, practitioners noticed there's major gaps in the historical record, right? Specifically from what we sometimes call marginalized communities. I like the wording, historically harmed communities, right? So that can be working class people, that can be communities of color, it can be LGBTQ communities, it can be communities of disability, right? There's a wide spectrum of what we mean by marginalized communities and people who have just frankly been left out of the historical record due to white supremacy, um, and and racism, and just the power dynamics that exist within institutions. And so it's imperative then to have trauma informed approaches to the practice, because people are going to share, their experience with racial violence, for example. And it's not really our job to re-trigger people, right? And so there is an element of knowing how to de-escalate situations. It can be as simple as stopping the recording and just checking in with them, saying, that seemed like a hard moment for you. Like, how are you doing? Um, but it's ultimately just following the lead of the narrator, right? Really being, attentive to them too. Um, and this kind of goes along. My other point I would say, like, it kind of goes along with my point about rolling consent. Throughout the entire process, we really should think of the narrator as a collaborator, as a direct collaborator, right? Who's deciding, with us how this is going to go. There's a phrase in the field called shared authority that comes up a lot, right? This idea of sharing authority with the narrator. And, I kind of push against that because I don't really have the authority to really tell anyone's story. Like, yes, I've had jobs and I've gotten degrees, um, but I don't really have the right to really tell anyone's story. What I think I can do is, support people in telling their story. I can help provide resources to do that if they want. But, this might sound strange, but, communities have always preserved their history. They sometimes haven't, they haven't needed outside people all the time to do that. There's always the local historian who's, doing their own preservation work. There's always the local storyteller. It's existed for generations, right? I'm not trying to downplay my work or the work of other professional public historians, because we can do it. We can offer a lot of skills and resources, but it's just knowing that, or it's really humbling ourselves a little bit, knowing that we're not always the ones that have the authority, right? And so it's really about making them the authority on it and really collaborating with them on it. So I just said a lot of things, so I'm going to stop talking now. But I'm happy to, if it ain't, I'm sure there might be some questions about what I said, or.
Well, I think that's perfect, and I'd like to segue into, you talked about the principles and the practices that you apply to oral histories, and I'd love to just talk a little bit more about how that reflects the work that you and the rest of the team are doing at the Alexandria Oral History Center, whether that's in terms of projects you're working on, or how you go about reaching out to community members, or how they reach out
Yeah.
to you about getting these stories collected and chronicled. Because Alexandria, there's no shortage of history. There's no shortage of people with their own past, their own memories. So how do you go about doing that work day to day and building this oral history archive?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a big part of it is, people heard of the slow food movement. Maybe you've heard of that. It's, this idea, right, of, well, yeah, I won't go too deep detail about it, but, it's really about taking your time, right, with cooking, with using natural ingredients, right. And I think that principle applies for oral history, right, too. It's like, we have to really practice a slower way of doing history. And so, in terms of how that impacts our work, you know, we we have to do things slowly, because again, it has to be rooted in trust and care. If it's not rooted in that, it will crumble. It will completely crumble. Or, what the process ends up being is really shallow, right? Kind of the same old. And so there is an element of slowness that, we take on. And so, there are many projects for us to work on in Alexandria. Everyone here knows that, more than I do. Um, but it takes time to do these projects. And so, we one of our projects that I'm really proud of is, we're working on the Douglas Cemetery project, um, and with Michael Johnson and the Social Responsibility Group, and we really have spent, Mike Johnson and SRG have been working on this for many years, much longer than I've been here. But I came here in 2022, and we didn't really start recording. We didn't really even start doing anything until last year, right? Until 2020, 2020, or sorry, this year, right? 2024. Or wait, it's 2025. Yes, last year, 2024. Um, um, and um, I think why that was a good thing is that there's a lot of mistrust, with community members, with institutions, with city governments. Um, you know, People feel like they've been harmed sometimes by institutions, um, and by specific individuals within those institutions. And so there is a lot of repair that's needed to start these projects. And so Douglas was an example of that. And we did spend a lot of time, but we were able to craft a scope of work with descendants. Descendants decided, with city staff, what a history project would look like for Douglas. They're also helping decide the physical preservation of Douglas. Um, Another project we're working on, with the same elements is Colored Rosemont, which is an area near the Braddock Station. It's the location of some of the first Black homeowners in the city. Again, that was a project that really started when I came in 2022, and we didn't really get to creating a scope of work and starting recordings until early this year. Um, we're also working on slowly working on a Latinx history of Alexandria, exploring areas of Alexandria. That's really in the initial stages, right? We're just developing those relationships, because they are lacking in terms of city government, having relationships with these communities. There's a little bit of a lack of institutional history. So we're building those relationships, and we're hoping it could potentially become like the work that's been done in Parker Gray, right? Thinking of Arlandra as a historical district, right? The site of some of the one of the largest Salvadorian communities in the region, right? So so yeah, those are some specific projects. We also, like I said, like I shouldn't be doing some of these oral histories or many of them. Sometimes having someone who looks like the person they're interviewing is better, right? It's a better experience for the narrator. And we are officially launching what we call our story kit program, this summer. And so we've informally started it. We've partnered with some organizations in the city. So simply what it is, it's an oral history training program for residents, for former residents. It's really open to the public to learn about oral history, right? To give you the basics. So it will cover 3 workshops. Each of them will be about 2-3 hours, and people will learn the fundamentals of oral history. Everything from how to craft interviews, how to use recording equipment, how to do preservation work, how to even how to activate it. Maybe learning how to edit some of the audio and use clips. Things like that. So that's being launched this summer, and so I encourage people here. If you go on our website, you can get on the waiting list for it. We unfortunately can't take everyone for this first round, but as what we're hoping we'll offer this throughout the year, maybe once or twice. So there's just some examples of things we work on. Um, so
Perfect.
yeah,
No, definitely. And one of the things that the Oral History Center is working on is taking a lot of these interviews that have been done, some of them have been done 30 years ago, and making them easier to access and getting them online so that anybody with an internet connection can access them. Can you talk a little bit about what's involved in that digitization process, where
sure.
people can go to access these oral histories, and what additions we can expect to see in the future to the online collection?
Sure. Yeah. So that is a really large project that we're working on. In addition to all these other large projects. So before I came on, the city didn't have a formal oral history program. But oral histories were collected, and sometimes they were done by volunteers. Sometimes they had like temporary staff who were assigned to it. Other times, archaeology, which I know each of you are familiar with. They did. Like people like Pam Cressy. I'm sure you know that name, right? Right, worked on oral histories. When they were working on certain projects. And so that's been going on since the 1980s up until probably I came. And there's about 220 of those oral histories that are on VHSs, on audio cassette tapes, microfilm, like just other kind of random formats that I've never even heard of. So we have about we've digitized practically all of it. So what I mean by that is that we've converted it all to digital files, so that we can easily put them online to be accessible. Um, we probably have like 10, 20 left, but we're practically done. Um, and so now we're in a different phase of it, which is we are creating transcripts. So a lot of them do not have transcripts, right? And I mentioned that earlier. Transcripts are as important as the actual recording. A lot of times users are using those transcripts more than they're actually listening to the audio. Just because you can quickly go through it. And so we have a team of volunteers, and people here are welcome to join. If you're interested, just write me after this, or you can sign up online on our website. We have a link. You can sign up, and you can join our transcript team. And they're slowly working on these so that we can present these to the public. Um, so yeah, and
Yeah.
and there's oral histories that we've never heard. Like there's some in there that are just they're gonna be just big surprises. Like, oh, and then there's other ones that we know exist that we haven't been able to access. Someone like um, Eudora Lyles, right, which was who's a big activist in the African American community. There's several interviews with her who are in this collection, right, that have not seen the who has not been out in the public yet. So we're excited to share these. Um, so yeah.
Absolutely. And that is something that a lot of places are coming to the realization that they've got these oral history collections and they're all over the place. Some aren't digitized, some are in one location, some are in the other.
Yeah.
And so that work takes time, that work takes effort, and certainly getting something transcribed is huge. So, again, as Francesco was saying, anyone who's attending this and who enjoys transcribing oral histories and or has never done it before and wants to give it a try, we will be providing contact information after the program about how you can get in touch with the Oral History Center. We'll also be providing links to some of the other things we discussed, the online oral history archive. So definitely I recommend getting involved in that, signing up for one of the training programs. If you're interested in transcribing, please do that. I've always found with transcribing oral histories, there are some people who love it, there are some people who hate it. I'm very much in the latter camp, so I love everybody who loves transcribing oral histories because it makes my job a lot easier.
Yeah.
I would like to just chat a little bit. Francesco, you were talking about some of the oral histories you do. Some are in a room with a microphone, maybe a little bit like this. This is one of the microphones I use for oral histories. Others, you're walking through the community with the narrator. Sometimes it's a group interview. Obviously, sometimes you got to mix up the equipment in order to accommodate some of those oral histories. So, can you talk about some of the equipment that the center is using to capture and collect these stories?
Yeah, so we use we have different tools that we use. So the main way we record is with something like this. It's blurring, unfortunately. Let me stop blurring my background. Um, so this is a Zoom H5 recorder. And so
Very
we
familiar with those.
yeah, so that's the common recorder used, and then we usually have these microphones, which are Shure SM58s. Um, and so we usually have like I'll be mic'd up, and then the narrator will be mic'd up, and we'll be recording um, their interview that way, and that's obviously only audio. That's a very formal way to do it. Um, that requires us to either do it in our space. We do go out to other people's spaces, But when we do, I do have to make sure that they have, a table and chairs, and we also need to kind of control the sounds in the environment so that it's not creating a lot of noise, background noise, things like that. Other times, depending upon the situation, a lot of people are intimidated by these massive microphones and the formality of it. So sometimes we'll just put this recorder out, that same Zoom 5. Um, um, so this is, you just put it on the table, and it can record people. It's just not going to be the same kind of quality, right? Like having a microphone on me and the narrators, it's that's like going to be like radio, NPR quality, right? Which is very important. I do want to stress, I think in the oral history field there is a tendency to kind of rely on um, more informal ways of recording, but the issue is, in 30 years, and we're experiencing this with our digitization project, they're just badly recorded, which means we can't even understand what they're saying, and so it's a balancing act. You don't want to intimidate people with microphones and all that, but you do need to. We have to be really attentive to how we were, making sure they're high quality, because otherwise it's just kind of a waste, you know. So that's one way. We also, I mentioned that those large group discussions, um, and so we have things like, this is an owl. I feel like I have like a bag of like toys here, just grabbing them. But this is a really useful device. You may have seen it in like meetings, because it's basically a camera that rotates, and it shows everyone in the room while you're doing like a Zoom call like this. It's really great for group interviews because you can get everyone on film, right? And you also can get the audio, but you can also film it. Versus if you have a camera, it's hard to get 6 people. You have to kind of turn the camera every time. So this is really useful. The audio quality isn't the best, but it does the trick. Um, I
Now
mentioned,
I'll jump in real quickly. It's also a big help for whoever's transcribing the interview,
yeah,
because then they can have an audio, they can have a visual to accompany the audio. And so if you have people who sound very similar, being able to see who's talking, that can be a
yeah,
huge help. And I know a number of transcriptionists who, when it comes to transcribing group oral histories, they are always very excited to hear when an owl is used.
yeah. Yeah, and then the other way we record is we have and we're in the midst of kind of transitioning to a new service, but we actually, for example, we do partner with organizations in the city, and so one of them is Trinity Church in Alexandria, and they want to do 50 recordings this year, which is it's their anniversary, so we obviously can't do that. That's where we don't have enough staff time to record 50 oral histories, right? But they want to do it, right? So I underwent a training with them, an oral history training with them, kind of like the Story Kit program. And then we use what we call like a story portal. So it's a service. Um, it's a hyperlink that you can access on your phone, on your browser, and then you can record your story with it, and then once you're done, it gets uploaded to me. And so we're actually, so in that sense, it's recording on the phone, which is also fine. But again, this is the lowest quality of recording you can do, unfortunately. But it does a trick, for that situation, and it gets uploaded to me, and so we call that kind of our story portal, and we do use that sometimes for these special projects that just have a lot of recordings that people want to do. I think, and we do have a video camera that we do. So we do video record. The issue with video recording, unfortunately, is just space. So when you do like an hour recording, it's gonna take up a lot more digital space, like a lot. Like we're talking, an audio recording can be 6 gigs, and video recording is like 80 gigs. And so just in terms of cost, it's hard to do video and pay for lots of storage. We do at least 25 oral histories a year, but we've been really doing close to 50. So if we do 50 oral histories and they're each 80 gigs, we're 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 gonna need several terabytes over the years, and that's very costly. Unfortunately, digital space is still very costly at the moment. So I don't recommend video for oral history, um, but I understand why people like it and why people want it. Um, and I would use it for special. I do use it for certain occasions, but we try to not. But for that, um, we do use like a H. It's a Sony. I don't remember. Actually, I don't remember off the top of my head right now. I don't remember off the top of my head right now. If people do want to know specific names for these things, I'm happy to share them after this. I can't think of it
Well,
now, but
yeah, we'll
yeah.
send it out and we'll send it out in the email afterwards. I would
Cool.
like to just touch briefly on some of the pros and the cons of doing an oral history using the format we're doing now, using a video conferencing platform like Zoom. And
Yeah.
obviously, this was something that a lot of oral historians had to use almost exclusively in 2020 during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, it's got its pluses, it's got its drawbacks, and I think our audience tonight would appreciate hearing your insights on that.
Yeah. So, and we were also doing recordings on Zoom, and we currently do some, right? Like there's especially for some of our special projects. For Douglas, for example, there's descendants in Philadelphia, in North Carolina, in California. So we obviously can't travel to these places. So we do Zoom, and Zoom's great. Zoom's actually a great way, in terms of quality. It's actually it's pretty high quality, as long as there's no background noise, and as long as you're in a quiet setting, it really does the trick. But obviously, virtual is, it's not as intimate, right? It's just a different experience, and so we don't rely on it a whole lot. But it is like another tool. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. I would like to throw open the gates to anyone who has any questions. Again, feel free to drop them in the chat. We've got one almost immediately from Mary Jones Owens. Thank you, Mary. Are there any places that rent equipment? So that's
So
a good point.
we,
Some of this stuff can be
yeah,
kind of pricey.
yeah. I didn't mention that. Like obviously the cheapest is your phone, and if that's what you got, that's what you got, and it does a great job. Phones do a great job. Um, so I would always choose a phone over spending money. Don't do that. If and then once like our story kits, they're with the microphones and everything, they're about 350 to 500. With the equipment, video cameras. Our video camera equipment is $4,000, right? Cameras are very expensive, and all the accessories you need for them. The owl is the owl comes out about 1,000 or 2,000, so it's not cheap either. So in terms of renting, so our story kit program, part of it is that we want to lease equipment for free to the public. So we do have 5 story kits, with those microphones I showed you, that we do lease, but we require people to go through our program. And if you are leasing it, it's to complete an oral history project, that you create during the workshops. So the workshops are not just you learning, but it's also you then creating a project that you want to work on. So it could be as simple as, I want to record my block, or I want to record, immigrant history or whatever. But in a workshop, you'll devise it, and then, yeah, later on you'll be able to potentially lease our equipment. Um, so yeah.
Okay, perfect. And kind of a follow up on that. So, say somebody has already done an oral history with family members, friends, and it relates to Alexandria. Do you accept donations of either audio or transcripts to the Alexandria Oral History Center?
Um, we do. Yeah. So we do acquire other collections. We're potentially acquiring a large oral history collection from someone. Um, um, So we certainly do. It would just be a conversation, and we have to go. We do have protocols. The city has collection protocols, um, and we'd have to follow those, um, and there's requirements that we need to meet. So it would just you'd be entering our city process for that. Yeah. So
And we've got another question, and it relates more to kind of the research side of when somebody, say, and I'll give myself as an example. I live near Potomac Yard, and I know there's been oral histories done of the workers who made Potomac Yard work,
yeah.
who managed the trains, got them from A to B, who lived nearby, built the communities of Delray and St. Elmo. How would
Yeah.
I go about, identifying the oral histories that might have the information I'm interested in? What's the best way to kind of approach researching an oral history collection?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in terms of accessing our collection, so we currently have an archive on our website, and so you can search with keywords, like I mentioned earlier. So, you can search Potomac Yard, you can search labor history, and everything will come up that we have. Um, you also can reach out to me. I'm obviously I'm very familiar with the collections. I can think of things maybe that don't always show up. And we're also uh, Oh, and I'll mention we also have mapped out our oral histories. If you go on our website, we have an oral history map. So you can actually, for example, you can go to Potomac Yards and you'll see what we have on Potomac Yards. So if you can geographically locate some oral histories through our map. And then there was one more thing I was going to say. So we're in the process of also changing our public archive. So right now, what you see will be much different and will be a lot more sophisticated in a year. Because right now, when you do search for things, it doesn't always work, and so we're trying to fix that in this year, and we're also adding 220 oral histories to the collection, hopefully this year, and the hope is that you'll be also able to listen to the oral histories, because right now all you can do is view the transcripts. So you'll be able to still view transcripts, but also listen to the audio that we have, and be able to better search. So
Yeah.
someone
And I'll
mentioned
add,
contacting the Queen Street Library. So our program's housed in the Office of Historic Alexandria, which is a city division, and the library is a separate entity. They're great for research. I would definitely recommend reaching out to them. They definitely have a great archive for local history, but our oral history collection is part of the city archive, not the library's archive. So
and I'll add real quickly, when it comes to doing research of oral history collections, sometimes, and a lot of the Alexandria ones have this, sometimes at the start of the transcript, they'll have a short synopsis of
yeah,
what is covered in the oral history. So that can be really valuable. And if a transcript has been digitized, you can, and it's been made so that you can search the text, you can do a keyword search. So if you're not sure, if you don't want to read through, 20, 40, 60 pages, you can do the keyword search. So if I'm interested in Arlandria, I can, I'm not sure if the transcript's relevant. I bring it up. I search Arlandria. I search, uh, Mount Vernon Avenue. I search the Birchmere, and then I can help figure out if it's going to be relevant to what I'm researching without having
yeah,
to read the entire thing. So
yeah,
not always an option, but definitely something to consider as you're going through collections.
yeah.
Right. Any other questions from anyone? Oh, interesting one. This one is what are your thoughts, hopes, concerns about AI and oral history?
Yeah, that is something that people talk a lot about right now. So when we create our transcripts, we actually use AI to create a draft of it. So we never create a transcript from scratch. Now, and so and so this is not really a surprise for us, but we quickly found that AI has all kinds of cultural biases. Essentially, if you're not a white cis man speaking, it is going to mess up or a white cis man from the Midwest with a Midwest dialect, it is going to screw you up all over the place. And so um, we have had to work really digital. We've really had to pay attention to the transcripts to make sure that we're preserving what people say, because it literally will change the sentence structure, not just misspell words or things like that, but it will change the grammar. And so the point of oral history is to preserve how people say it, right? We don't want to change how people say it. So there's an abundance of cultural biases that we'll have to deal with AI. But other than that, we don't dabble with AI a whole lot. It's not really part of our process. Um, but I think for historical research, related to this, I do think there is a really important place for it. I've used ChatGPT. If I need kind of like a overview of, what have people said about, a specific historical, what have scholars said about a specific historical topic. I've looked at ChatGPT just to kind of see what it comes up with. I'm obviously not going to just follow what it says, but I think it is really useful for the humanities to use ChatGPT and AI, when wanting to even get like a summary of a certain book, that you don't have time to read. Or I'm not saying you shouldn't read books or you shouldn't do your own research, but it's like the transcript. It's a way to kind of create some sort of draft, right? And then it's your job to kind of really beef it up and make sure that you do your due diligence. But it is quite useful, I think. But just being aware that it has lots of cultural biases, and you have to be pretty critical of it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. The human review, when working with robots, the human review is even more critical, I'd say.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, sure.
All right. Any other final questions before we wrap it up tonight? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, Francesco, thank you so much for sharing the work that you and the rest of the team at the Oral History Center are doing. For everyone who attended, thank you all for attending. We will be sending out an email probably sometime tomorrow or Friday with the information that was discussed tonight, with links. If you want to reach out, Francesco's contact information will be there if you want to reach out to them with any follow-up questions. So again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I mentioned earlier, my interest in the oral histories done of the workers at Potomac Yard, and that was partially I am interested, but it also ties into our next lecture, which is next week via Zoom. David Alf, the author of the Northeast Corridor, the trains, the people, the region, the culture, which is a history of the Northeast region rail connections. He's going to be talking about the history of railroads of the Northeast region, Amtrak, all of that history, and how it connects to Washington, D.C., and also Alexandria. So if you're interested in that history, if you're interested in rail and transit, definitely register for that. It is completely free. You can send it to the exact same email account you did to register for this one. We will be releasing our full slate of events for the upcoming year very soon, so keep an eye on our website and our social media pages. But otherwise, again, thank you all for coming. Francesco, thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. This has been an Alexandria Historical Society behind the scenes program. And on behalf of the board, I thank you all. And I hope you all have a very nice evening and stay warm.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks, Scott.